This is perhaps a bit outside the scope of what we'll talk about today, but just to lay out the context on slavery in general in human history, we should say that slavery was ubiquitous. It existed in virtually every major civilization in the history of humans. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, the Islamic world, Africa, the Americas, North and South America. We should also say something that, as I was looking into this, another big topic, which is the Atlantic slave trade. And it was surprising to me, the stat I wasn't aware of. I would venture to say most Americans probably don't know that only 4% of African slaves were brought to North America, to the United States.
Brazil is the main destination.
Brazil, the Caribbean was over 90%, 4.9 million in Brazil, 4 million in the Caribbean. And it was also the last of the Americas to abolish the slave trade. So only 4% of the Atlantic slave trade went to the United States. So there's the story of human slavery is one that reaches deep into our history and geographically is much larger than we often study in the context of the United States.
One thing the war, the Civil War, which I'll just call the war for the rest of our discussion, I mean, one thing it did was end slavery in 4 years in the United States, whereas in the absence of that war, it might have gone on for decades. I think the United States would have had the ignominious distinction of being the last place to get rid of slavery. Would have been after Brazil, would have been after Spanish Cuba, because it was thriving in the United States in 1860. It was making the transition from cash crop agriculture to industrial applications and other applications growing of not growing just cotton and rice and sugar. There was a time in the literature when people argued that the war was needless, Civil War was needless because slavery was on its way out. That's absolutely wrong. It was not on its way out. It was thriving. Lincoln said at one point he thought it might have lasted another 50 years, and I don't know how many years it would have lasted, but I think it would have lasted longer than it did in either Cuba or Brazil if the war hadn't taken place.
So slavery was flourishing in the United States from an economics perspective,
Yes.
especially.
The wealthiest part, the 1860 census is our friend, and it tells us that the people who controlled the most wealth in the United States were slaveholders, and their property in slaves alone, not their other holdings, not their land holdings, just property in slaves, were valued at about $3 billion. The value of all industries, all railroads, all of that put together, fewer than $2.5 billion. So the people who controlled the most wealth, by far, were the slaveholding class.
So it was the most valuable industry in the United States. And perhaps it is the reason, again, a bit out of scope, but maybe it helps lay out the land. Let's look at the 19th century. So most slave-owning societies of the era were able to abolish slavery without people dying at the mass scale that we'll discuss. So Britain freed 800,000 slaves in 1833 by buying their freedom. Russia freed 23 million serfs in 1861 with a decree, so legally. Brazil, which imported more than 10 times as many enslaved Africans as the United States, abolished slavery in 1888 through basic ordinary legislation. No violence. Why did the U.S. have a civil war with an estimated 750,000 people dead in order to abolish slavery?
Yes, let's talk just for a second about the 750,000 dead soldiers we're talking about. The number for years was 618,000, and that's been revised lately. I think we're probably certainly more than 700,000, by far the bloodiest war in our history as a percentage of the population off the charts, by far the bloodiest. I think there's a big difference between Great Britain doing it and the United States doing it. Is Great Britain did it in other places. There weren't millions of enslaved people in Great Britain at the time. I think it's for them, it might have been a little bit easier to free enslaved people who don't live among you than in the United States. The ante is up for the Confederacy because the enslaved people lived here, and I think a lot of them were afraid of them and what would happen if they weren't enslaved anymore. The war goes from, it doesn't begin as a war to end slavery. There's a major shift in the war, begins in the summer of 1862, where you add to the war, the war aim for the United States initially is to suppress the rebellion, which is what they called this. They didn't call it the Civil War for the most part during the war. It's the War of the Rebellion. That's the goal initially. As the war goes on and becomes costlier and more all-encompassing, they decide that they're not going to be able to suppress the rebellion unless they also strike at slavery, because slavery underpins the Confederate war-making capacity. You have enslaved labor that keeps the economy going and allows the Confederacy to mobilize between 85 and 90% of all their white military-age males. It's an astonishing mobilization. It's only possible because enslaved labor keeps the economy going. If you take that enslaved labor away, it deals a significant blow to the Confederate economy and by extension to its ability to wage a 19th century war.
So the Emancipation Proclamation was in part a military strategy.
Abraham Lincoln based it entirely on his war-making power as commander-in-chief in a time of open rebellion. His inclination, he's often been criticized for not including the soaring language he was capable of in the Emancipation Proclamation. One historian likened it to a bill of lading. It had all the soaring language of a bill of lading. He did that on purpose. He did it because he doesn't have the power to strike at slavery in the absence of a war. The president doesn't. And he did it because he knows that he can't win the war with only Republicans in the army. He needs to keep Democrats on board with the war as well. They're not in favor of emancipation. The one way that they might accept it is as a tool to help achieve union. And to do that, we've got to strike at the rebels this way, strike at slavery. That will hurt their war effort, and it will also punish the people who brought on the war. And that would so Lincoln hoped that by basing it strictly on his war power, it might be more widely accepted across all parts of the loyal states and not as controversial as it was. It was still intensely controversial. It alienated many Democrats when he issued it, who said, "You're changing what this war is about. We're willing to shed our blood and maybe risk our lives to restore the Union of the founders. I'm not going to risk my life to free a black person." That's a very, very common attitude among Democrats.
So what did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? It emphasized the freeing of slaves in the South.
It's even more complicated than that. The only place that Lincoln said he had the power as the war leader to strike at slavery is where the rebels were actually still in rebellion and in control. So any place where the U.S. Army was in control, any place, he said that is in essence United States territory now. I can't free them there because I don't have the power. I can only free them where we don't have the power. So he exempted parts of states and areas in the South that it didn't apply to as of the moment he signed it. Going forward, any place that the United States Army went where it hadn't been on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation applied, and enslaved people would be freed by it. Literally at the time he signed it, he didn't free anybody because he's only saying I can free them where we're not in control. We have to be in control for this to have effect, for this to have power.
So in part, this is why the Army was the boundary which the freeing was happening.
It's absolutely the boundary. And Congress had already passed what was called the Second Confiscation Act. It passed this in July of 1862 that announced that all enslaved people belonging to rebels were free. It didn't apply to people who could prove they were Unionists living in the South and owned slaves. Lincoln didn't make that distinction in the Emancipation Proclamation. His proclamation is broader than the Second Confiscation Act was.